Hey folks, this is Kalani. I want to have a chat about one of the most controversial systems that was changed or introduced in Legion, and that would be the Legendary system. With so many people feeling a bit crappy about the Legendaries they have received, it's got to make you wonder what went wrong between the time Blizzard thought this was an amazing idea and when we actually got our hands on it. So I want to ask and try to answer a simple question. Are Legendaries in Legion a failure? To start with, let's have a look under the hood at how this system works and what changes are planned for the next content patch 7.2. Whenever you play the game and loot something, pretty much no matter what you are doing, there's a small chance for you to loot a ridiculously powerful item in the form of a legendary. To combat terrible RNG, there is also a bad luck protection system which increases the chances of your legendary drop every time you do some content which could yield a legendary. So if you keep running dungeons, keep killing raid bosses and keep opening your emissary caches, you'll eventually get a legendary. That's the basic idea. A proposed change for 7.2 is that individual specs will have their own bad luck protection, so even if you have 5 legendaries for one spec and want to swap, you should see legendaries for that new spec quite a bit faster once 7.2 goes live. A nice little update which honestly should have been there from the start, but surely obtaining such a powerful item is going to be great no matter what it is, right? All those stats for an item 40 odd item levels ahead of most of your gear can't surely be a bad thing. This is where we hit problem number 1. This system seems to have been designed with a all legendaries are great mindset. No matter what legendary you get, it should be a huge upgrade and you should be excited about it. It also shouldn't matter that your next legendary will take a little bit longer to obtain because you're happy with the one you just got. Sadly, this hasn't really been the case because some legendaries feel lackluster compared to the others. The balance just hasn't been there for a lot of these items, which is super frustrating. First, because that seems to limit what cool things Blizzard can do with these legendary items, and second, no one wants to feel like they got the bad legendary. This is partly our fault. Any legendary is a huge upgrade and you should be excited about getting one, but it's human nature to look at what other people got and compare. If it turns out you got something less useful, or which provides less damage, it takes the shine off that once glowing reward. The balance problem is entirely on the dev team though. At the top level, this game has always and will always be a numbers game. When you have people toiling away, figuring out the best talent setup and best way to play your class for maximum damage or healing or what have you, you can sure as hell bet they'll go through the same effort to pull apart the legendaries piece by piece and see which are the best when it comes down to raw numbers gain. In a community of min-maxers, you will always have the best and the worst legendaries, and that's how it's going to be. You can narrow that gap with balancing efforts, but you'll be fighting a constant battle. I'd say the largest problem when it comes down to balance is what legendaries actually do or their effects. Having a legendary which reduces the cooldown on your major DPS cooldowns is always going to be better than getting healed a little bit when you stand still. Getting a huge boost to your hardest hitting ability is always going to trump being able to cast on the move now and again. Some of these legendaries definitely have their place and a clear effect on how you play your class, but I'd argue that a lot of them don't change your playstyle enough. I'd love to see some crazy legendaries which really change up how you end up approaching your class and spec. The legendary system in Diablo worked so well because there were so many variations of the same loot slot which did so many different things. I think the reason they could get away with that is because Diablo also had so many different spells and runes to change how your character played to begin with. We don't really have that diversity with World of Warcraft classes. Diablo did have its fair share of useless legendaries too, so I guess more legendaries wouldn't really solve any issues, but adding a few more which really change up how you play, maybe for a risk-reward deal, could be a lot of fun and actually see some play. Sadly, I don't think legendaries in WoW were designed to really shake up the spec, they were just meant to augment them. Some increase single target damage, some increase AoE damage, and some help you stay alive a bit longer. That's sort of the extent of what our legendaries do, no matter what class or spec you play. With legendaries being a little boring in their effects, it's no wonder people default to wanting the one which increases their numbers the most. A lot of legendaries feel like an extra tier set bonus just tacked on the side, which could actually be a bad thing for our tier sets going forward. We've sort of taken quite a few useful effects for our legendaries, so I wonder if it's been more difficult coming up with new and exciting set bonuses in Legion. We also know that eventually Blizzard wants us to swap legendaries around depending on what boss encounter we're facing next. That means they always intended for us to collect most of them, if not all of them, by the end of the expansion. I'm not too sure carrying around a bag full of legendaries and spare gear to let me swap them around is going to be all that fun. Going back to how legendaries drop and how often, it's easy to see why people are annoyed or dissatisfied. Obviously, if we only have a few legendaries and an entire expansion to go through, we're not going to get them all at once. There's going to be gating there no matter what we do, because Blizzard probably doesn't want to keep churning out new legendaries every patch. That means what we've got is going to last a while to keep that carrot dangling nicely in front of our face. This ties into the balance problem. If the first few legendaries you get aren't the ones you wanted, it feels pretty damn bad knowing you've got quite a trek to seeing your next legendary drop, and you still only have a 1 in 4 or 5 chance of seeing the one you want. So not only do we have our best items locked behind a huge time gate and a grind, but we can't even influence the item we'll receive. It's all crossed fingers and prayers to RNGesus until that shiny message appears telling us we've once again failed in our quest for the best in slot legendaries. Speaking of quests, wouldn't that be nice? A long quest chain to decide our first legendary would go a long way to soothing the aching hearts of our fellow WoW players. Except Blizzard don't really like the idea of giving us a straight line to a specific legendary, because then everyone would have the same ones. That's actually the response they gave, meaning they recognize the issue with balancing at least. There's also the other side of this argument as well. If you happen to get super lucky and get your best few legendaries first, everyone after that is kind of just dead weight. You might not feel too bad about someone getting their best legendaries first, but at the end of the day, they won't get any enjoyment out of the system after that. There's no point looking forward to another legendary because the ones that are left are useless to you. So if you get too lucky, you actually almost remove an entire reason to keep playing certain content, which may lead you to getting a little bored a bit faster than others. At least everyone else would have a reason to keep playing. So what about other methods of targeting our legendaries? It just so happens that 7.2 will bring us the ability to target specific legendaries of a given loot slot. It's another system which has almost been cut from Diablo 3 and spliced into WoW. It's a blood shard vendor. If you haven't played Diablo 3 in the last few years, basically you farm and farm and farm these blood shards, then you buy and buy and buy the slot you're wanting a legendary from. The items you buy are completely random, but are all for that loot slot. So if you're wanting a belt, you buy up hundreds of belt tokens, hoping for your super lucky legendary belt to be among them, and if it's not, you go back to farming. That's literally what we have coming in 7.2 for the Broken Shore. The currency used for this vendor is nether shards, which are farmed by doing a bunch of different activities on the Broken Shore, and each token costs 2,000 right now, which is quite a bit, I have to say. Then you go and buy your tokens, which have a tiny chance to become your legendary item. Not the most exciting system in the world, but it's a lot better than just hoping you'll get a belt out of however many legendaries you have left to collect. The only problem I see with this system is the drop rate. On one side, you can't expect people to farm this stuff forever. But if there's only one belt legendary, and that's what you're looking for, how quickly can you expect to receive it? If it's too quick, you could farm up all your remaining legendaries if you were so inclined. This system worked in Diablo because there were so many legendaries that you could get, which could at least be a little useful. They also worked a little differently stat-wise, so even if you had what you were looking for, you could keep farming and trying for the exact same item because it could get better stats. We don't have that random factor in WoW, thankfully. Everything is static in item level and stat allocation. That means this new system either has a very limited shelf life because it lets you get your legendary relatively easily, or it's going to be the worst grind we've seen in a few expansions. I don't really think there's a middle ground with this system because the number of legendaries we have for each slot is just so low, but at least we can target specific slots now. Even though we don't have all that many legendaries for each slot, we still have access to a large amount of legendaries for what a legendary has always been in World of Warcraft. We used to have huge quest lines, super low drop chances, lore-infused relics of power, or, in some cases, just an excuse to create a weapon of tremendous power. But every legendary before Legion was at least special. Mr. Pandaria started the Legendaries for Everyone game, and with each expansion it seems as though legendary items have become the new epics. They're not all that special anymore. Whether that's a problem or not comes down to personal opinion, but no one looks at a hunter with snowshoes and says, "Oh my gosh, you have the snowshoes? You must have spent so long completing quests, gathering rare items and materials and braving unknown dangers to obtain those." Nah, I got them out of my first emissary cache. Are they special? it just doesn't have the same impact as it once would have. It feels like Blizzard probably knew this though. That's why they didn't spend the time giving the legendaries their own models or appearances. If you haven't noticed yet, they're pretty much all reused from older expansions. You can't even tell what legendary someone is wearing by just looking at their character. That's a little sad itself when there's nothing shiny or flashy you can show off. At least the mop cloaks had a very pretty particle effect. When you call something a legendary item and there's almost zero pomp and nothing special about the way it looks, it doesn't exactly feel that legendary. So should it be called a legendary item? Are we going to have to go one step higher again because legendary items became too boring that there's no excitement around them? If it gets that far, what's the point anymore? I think the most successful legendary items were probably the Cataclysm ones. Sure, everyone didn't get their turn, and it sucked if you weren't one of the special classes this time around, but that could have easily been rotated for the next expansion. There's something about a long quest chain which is just drenched in lore and reason, which makes obtaining a legendary so much sweeter. It really does take some of the pizzazz out when it's a random drop from literally any form of content. All that being said, the legendaries are set up in a way to be a huge increase in power. Even if you don't get one of the ideal ones, it's always going to be better equipping a legendary over any spare piece of gear you might have, so at least that's worthwhile. But this has introduced its own set of issues. Because you're able to equip 2 legendaries after completing your Order Hall research, that research is required for everybody 100% of the time. That causes any alts on new characters to be further behind than they would have been, to the point where I've seen posts and messages about people being turned away or declined from groups or guilds because they don't have 2 legendaries or can't equip both of them. While I can see this as being a little bit of a hurdle for some people, there's no real excuse for not having this research completed. I honestly like that some part of the Order Hall provides a huge bonus to the point that it's required, which they have actually changed recently in 7.2. The new research was going to be another huge power increase, and they've changed it to something which a lot of people probably won't care too much about. Another thing people tend to complain about is being removed or declined from groups because they don't have the good legendaries. While I have seen some guild members feel like they've been replaced or sat for the same class and spec simply because the new chap has better legendaries, every case that I have personally seen wasn't just about the legendaries. They themselves were lacking in other areas, though I'm sure the legendaries didn't help. That's coming from a high-end progression guild's point of view, but at the lower end of things, especially where pugs are concerned, this mindset can ruin someone's chances of progressing. To me, this is absolutely ridiculous, and I think it is more of a scapegoat than anything, but I see it time and time again as a reason why the legendary system is a failure. It has plenty of drawbacks, sure, but I think this one is overstated quite a bit. Anyone who doesn't want you in their group simply due to the legendaries you have probably isn't worth grouping with anyways. But there is one huge problem with thinking like this, but thankfully it's limited to a very small group of people. In Legion, it can be very beneficial now to level multiple characters of the same class. The idea is that you level a bunch of hunters, for example, play them all, gear them all, and when they get their first legendaries, you ditch the one that got something bad. That leaves you with at least one good legendary, and you keep gearing those hunters. Eventually you will get your second legendary, and then you can see which hunter to play and gear as your main. The top guilds in the world, and frankly anyone who cares about getting the perfect legendaries, have actually been doing this. Some guilds will run 2 to 4 runs of the current raids every week with different alts, so the extra characters that didn't get good legendaries are simply used for alt and split runs. They were leveling up a bunch of characters to be able to do split runs anyway, but by creating multiple of the same class, they have a much higher chance of one of them getting the best legendaries. Quite frankly, it's a bit too much work for me. If I were to make an alt, I'd want to play something different for a change, but these guys and gals are all about min-maxing in some of the craziest ways you can imagine. I wouldn't say this is an entirely intended feature of the current legendary system, but it's an interesting side effect of how it currently works. The one saving grace for legendaries is that some of them are truly awesome. The Holy Priest Cloak has saved us time and time again and lets you cheese so many mechanics for fights in a weird and interesting way that I'd put it up there with one of the best legendaries in the game so far. It doesn't give you an instant throughput increase, but gives you options of how to use its proc. Out of all my Hunter legendaries, I can't think of one which can really compete with how cool and useful the Priest Cloak is. I feel that's how everyone should feel about whatever legendary they have. Obviously that's going to be crazy hard to achieve, but legendaries that have a cool effect will always place higher than a boring legendary which just increases the damage of something. If you want more damage, it should be through a cool and exciting change to an ability. I guess that ties into the start of this discussion where we talked about balance and how everything can't really be the same, but I'd like to see more interesting legendaries rather than just more powerful legendaries. It is worth noting that a lot more legendary changes are coming for 7.2, which I'm sure I'll take a look at in another video. The examples we have are adding a throughput bonus to legendaries which currently don't have a throughput bonus, adding extra stats to a legendary item where a throughput bonus doesn't make sense, making improvements to legendaries whose design isn't working well in gameplay, and more numbers tuning to bring the throughput benefits of other legendaries more in line with each other. So, at least they're keeping on top of the system as a whole and fighting that constant battle of tuning and balance. We'll have to see what they come up with, but so far I would say the legendary system is a bit of a failure. It's definitely got some good merits, but the system overall has a few too many holes and I think we've been sinking since launch. But that's it for this video. How do you feel about the legendaries so far? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below, along with any questions or queries you might have. Or hop on over to Discord. We have a server at discord.gg/Kalani, great place to ask questions or just hang out. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.